Welcome to Angels and Seer Stones. I'm Chris.
And I'm Christine.
Today's episode features a discussion with Jessica and Barrett Burgin, the directors of a new short film, The Angel. It's a 19th century horror story set in an isolated farm in southern Utah.
It's a powerful period piece that considers the hardships of plural marriage, angelic visitations, and the anxiety of supernatural deception. And the greatest thing about this film is that it's chock full of Latter-day Saint folklore.
Plus, Jessica Burgin is going to tell us about one of her own family stories about supernatural assault.
You're going to want to stick around.
Latter-day Saints are a people of radical faith. We are a unique body of Bible-believing Christians. For us, the scriptural canon has been opened. The traditional sacraments have expanded. Our beliefs and practices are steeped in universalism, esotericism, and apocalypticism.
The Latter-day Saint tradition is a religion in which angels visit everyday people, and sometimes men and women see the divine in stones. In this podcast, we examine the lived religion of Latter-day Saints, our beliefs, and our stories.
We take seriously the whole gamut of Latter-day Saint experience. Join us, Christine and Chris Blythe,
two professional folklorists and Latter-day Saint converts,
as we openly discuss our faith while exploring the traditions of our chosen people. So a few weeks ago, we sat down with our new friends, Barrett and Jessica Burgin. They were in town from Tennessee, and so we had them over, recorded a lengthy interview, and had a great dinner party. I really enjoyed getting to know them. I think they share a lot of our own deep reverence for LDS creativity, and most importantly, owning Latter-day Saint identity.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it too. They're a wonderful husband and wife duo who are working together for the first time on this short film. Before we dive into our discussion of horror and folklore, let's have them introduce themselves and let's let them talk a little bit about why they're doing what they do.
So my name is Jessica Burgin, and I fell into film backwards, but I was always interested in the arts. And when Barrett and I came back together after a long story of how we met and fell in love and got married, I knew that I wanted to pursue it alongside him.
My name is Barrett Burgin. I've made movies since I was in second grade and all kinds of stuff. I really like thrillers and horrors and typically only direct it. So Jessica's got all of this incredible experience production managing and producing, and I'm usually writing and directing. But as far as exploring the Latter-day Saint mythos and elements within my work, that's become a thing in my young adulthood.
I think for us, our identity as Latter-day Saints is such a significant, not even part of our lives, like it is our whole life. I think it's just kind of part of our DNA.
Jessica and myself and many other young filmmakers have come together and decided it's time for a new wave of Mormon cinema built around the fact that Mormonism in storytelling functions as what Terry Rossio calls a strange attractor, right? It's interesting and unique and different enough that it pulls an audience in just for the sake of the Mormonism.
So that's the Burgins, a couple who've been pondering Latter-day Saint culture and film and have recognized the appeal of the peculiarity of our stories. And Barrett has already done a lot with that in previous works, but now they're working together for their first foray into horror.
Yeah, and that's interesting in and of itself.
Right, because for a long time, readers of LDS literature believed that we just didn't do horror. In 2024, it's clear that horror is a genre that's becoming increasingly interesting to Latter-day Saint authors.
That's true, but we really don't have great examples of Latter-day Saint produced horror, not in film and certainly not set in the LDS mythos. Barrett and Jessica brought a copy of The Angel to our home so Chris and I could watch from the comfort of our couch, which was absolutely incredible. And I have to be honest, it is a bit disturbing.
There's no question about that.
So The Angel is a story about a pioneer family living in 1870s in rural Utah. And we follow the story of two women who are sister wives and their husband who are trying to make it in their settlement. They're isolated. They don't live near any neighbors.
They're the last remaining members of a colonization effort.
And the wives have some different perspectives and experiences on their life. One is pretty content and happy to be in this family, and the other is discontent. She's questioning the choices that she's made that have led her to this point. She's not in love with carving out her own life in the desert. She yearns for the East, where there's more civilization, more education, more arts and community.
One evening, the second wife privately confides in the first wife that she is once again with child.
Perhaps we'll bless our husband with posterity at last.
First wife pities her, expressing her recent discontentment with their circumstances.
And I pray this child finds her way east, where there is more water and less barbarism.
In her doubt, she is seeking something more. And so she has an experience where she's completing one of her chores and she has an angel or a supernatural angelic being appear to her and deliver a message that is quite frightening.
The next morning, the husband leaves for a distant part of the farm. The first wife waits until the husband is miles away, then approaches the second wife and tells her she's seen something marvelous and that it concerns her child.
I've seen the most marvelous thing. I want to show you.
The first wife leads the second into the woods, where she begins to pray fervently. The second wife is uncertain, finding the first wife's newfound devotion strange and out of character. A vision opens and an angel appears. The second wife is terrified and tries to back away, but the first wife bids her to listen.
Wilt thou do whatsoever I ask of thee?
If you are true.
And the rest of the story is the two women determining whether or not this is a true messenger or a false messenger, and whether or not they should obey what this messenger tells them.
So the film blends elements of LDS folklore, of belief, of course, history. It often does this in very subtle ways, so much so that a non-Latter-day Saint may miss the more esoteric beliefs that are woven through the story. For us, it's this folklore that really set the film apart.
Right, and what's particularly compelling, as you'll see, is that this story has major ties to Jessica's own family lore.
We derive a lot of inspiration from Latter-day Saint folklore in this story, especially in the second half of the film. The association of spiritual visitations happening in conjunction with water, even the association that the devil might have power over water. We pull references from very old descriptions of what supernatural personages might be wearing, ways to identify them. D&C 129 is not only explicitly referenced visually in the film, but also inherent to the tension and the drama.
So something that's fascinating is I actually have some ancestors who lived in southern Utah around the same time period as our film. And I knew this. I've always been really interested in my own family history. I actually forgot about it literally until we were driving down to film, or maybe it was to do a location scout. And as we were driving through and approaching Orderville, I was like, hey, wait a minute. I have this crazy ancestor story about some evil spirits that came to them. So I looked up the story and I was like, I cannot believe how much this is like falling into the same kind of storyline and setting as this film that we're making. And then I thought, okay, that's probably not a coincidence. This is not made entirely out of whole cloth. So this family history story I have is from some ancestors who lived in Orderville, Utah in the 1870s, which was an interesting time. This is when they were living the United Order, which is essentially all things shared, all things in common. So there are a couple incidences that occur with these family members. One night, my ancestral grandfather was away from home, and he had this strong feeling at this meeting that he needed to go home. So he says, as I neared the house, a very uneasy feeling came over me, and my hair fairly seemed to stand on end. For as I stepped onto my doorstep, a strange man confronted me. Some power told me that it was an evil spirit. I looked him in the eye, rebuking him in the name of Jesus Christ, and ordered him from the home. And the man steps aside and goes down the path and leaves the gate out of the house. And so my grandfather goes in to check on his wife, my grandmother, and she is gasping and struggling for air. And he asks her what's wrong, and she says, "Someone is choking me. Help me, Tom." So he takes her in his arms and holds her close, and an evil influence fills the room, according to his journal. And she laid there quietly and seemed exhausted and then began to struggle again. So he gets down on his knees and rebukes the evil spirit from their home in the name of Jesus Christ. And as he does, something catches him by the hair of his head and lifts him from his knees. He rebukes the spirit again, doesn't see anything, and he felt conscious of someone leaving the room. And at once the foul, sickening atmosphere leaves the room, and a cool, fresh breeze takes the place and revives his fainting wife. And so then she tells him that 2 men came into the room while her husband was gone, and they told her that her aunt had passed away and that they would take my grandmother in the same manner when the baby was born. My grandmother was pregnant. And later they heard that her aunt had died around this time. And so anyway, fast forward several months later, she gives birth to a baby girl, and she's resting. And so her husband says, "Okay, I'm going to go tell some other family members nearby that the baby's been born." And they've been anxiously waiting to hear the news. And so he leaves the house and comes back and finds her once again in a dead faint. And she said that once again, the 2 men who threatened her life came back to the house as soon as her husband left and said that they had come to get her. And so he stayed by her side, afraid to leave her again. And he leaves for just a few minutes to go see his mother. And as soon as he gets a short distance away, a neighbor comes running and says that Lydia's dying. So this is my ancestor's name, Lydia. And they have some elders minister to her, rebuking evil spirits from the home. And she was immediately brought back to consciousness. And after this experience, he always stayed at her bedside until she was well enough to resist this evil influence. These ancestors were also polygamists. And so this was her first baby and before the other wife was introduced to the family. But I thought it was fascinating. It gave me a more personal feeling, like we're exploring some things that actually happened to people in our own family history.
We were only miles away from where this happened. We were in Kanab, where the cave lakes are, right? There's water that comes up from the ground, and then these desert, brutal-looking red caves, which we just aesthetically, as filmmakers, both in exploring those interesting elements of folklore with water, and then also Red Rock, southern Utah, has so many ghost stories and ideas about Gadianton robbers and ideas that area is haunted. And to find that Jessica's family stories with some of this supernatural mysticism was within walking distance, within some driving distance of where we were, was really fascinating. And to Jessica's point about pulling from his history, like she mentioned, this is a fictional story. We made it up to make a point and have a consistent theme and an idea. It's very much a comment on the faith itself in some ways. Our cultural distaste for those kinds of stories is actually relatively recent. The very first miracle of the church is a sort of exorcism, casting the devil out. All of these stories in church history, this was like a common identifier of the early Latter-day Saint experience, was possessions and combating them. And this is true in the New Testament. We're trying to pull from historical accounts and inspiration rather than just make up our own, because it has precedent within our history.
So it's one thing to create a Latter-day Saint horror movie set in the era of pioneers. That's going to be a tad controversial. But the Burgins went a step further to highlight plural marriage. And more than that, they highlight a plural marriage that is deeply broken. We've asked Jessica to tell us more about how she thought plural marriage played into the story.
Plural marriage or polygamy is a very big topic. Definitely can't summarize that in one comment. But it's a highly emotional issue, particularly for women. And it can also be a very divisive issue in terms of how it's approached within the Latter-day Saint community. And I think a lot of the fear surrounding it is feelings of abandonment, loneliness, insecurity, injustice. Just there's a lot of hardship associated with sharing a husband and having to deal with all of these emotions. And I think it's the perfect background for a horror film, because there's just a lot of inherent tension within the context of polygamy. So we play with that a little bit in terms of the dynamic with the wives. But this film is not particularly a comment on polygamy as much as it's using that as part of the backdrop for the story, adding to this feeling of horror or fears of what's everyone's intention? Am I being treated fairly? Am I going to have my heart broken? Another thing that I think is just worth mentioning is also the focus within polygamy on building a family. And this is actually something that I contributed to the short film in particular because I felt that it didn't make sense in previous drafts that there was no mention of any children involved. And we knew that this would be complicated. We didn't want to go to the degree of having children in the story because there are just a lot of logistical issues, and that would make the story a little too big to be a short film. But I felt like it was important to answer the question of like, why don't they have any children, especially with two wives in the family? Because a lot of the understanding of marrying another wife was to increase posterity, and that's not the whole of why polygamy was practiced and the doctrines behind it, but that is a big piece of it. In my headcanon of the story, the first wife is barren, and we've done some thematic things in the story to suggest that, being in a barren landscape and her sort of having moved past that, knowing that I cannot have children. And the second wife keeps losing children. She's not carrying them to full term. I know that there are women who don't resonate particularly with the idea of motherhood. For me, I very much resonate with it. And to me, it's a very feminine motivation to be motivated by protecting a child. To me, that was an important element within plural marriages, that there's also the consideration of a future generation and a child being brought into this family, and the potential of losing that child motivate the characters to make the decisions that they do.
All right, I want to end this episode with Barrett's discussion of his philosophy. I suppose their united philosophy behind Latter-day Saint film. I think you're really going to enjoy this.
A lot of times I think our gut instinct is to run away from it, right? We want to be normal, and let's show how normal and just like everyone else we are. Ironically, this has an opposite effect. It can be, one, quite disingenuous and off-putting to an audience, and two, why would you dumb down and water down the elements that make your story interesting? Running away from the elements that make us one of the most strange and peculiar, unique religious expressions of contemporary American and now worldwide history can actually be off-putting to someone who's not familiar with them, trying to convince them how normal you are. And being unique and different is universal. That is very human. And by leaning into the things that we're sometimes culturally afraid to talk about can actually be very disarming to an audience and interesting to them because you're bringing them into your world. This can be tough to convey in Utah, where the church is the dominant culture. But since Jessica and I are from Tennessee, we have observed how exotic Mormonism is to everyone and thus functions as a strange attractor. It attracts the audience to want to be brought into your world, particularly if you are willing to share with them the very things that make Mormonism so unusual and so fascinating, and in our view, so beautiful and robust and profound. And especially if you're doing so in a way that is not trying to preach to them or convince them of anything, but rather tell a great story or simply make an interesting point. To my point, Hollywood does this all of the time with Mormonism, with Latter-day Saint ideas and stories. If you slap Mormon on the identifier, the show or the movie is going to get more attention. We believe that too, but we believe we're more qualified to tell those stories because we embrace that identity.
There it is. If you're interested in hearing the Burgins discuss their take on the use of horror by Latter-day Saint filmmakers, check out our video on Instagram.
This really is an important conversation because disturbing content in Latter-day Saint film is definitely something that can catch us off guard. That said, we are absolutely stoked about this new film and the future full-length feature.
Christy and I intend to watch The Angel this month, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity for all of us to watch it together. So stay tuned for that. And friends, we'll see you next time.
See you next time.